Hitman 3 is right around the corner, with a strong amount of hype from a very dedicated fan base and myself included. But looking back, we almost never even got Hitman 2. During that time, the franchise's developers IOInteractive were plagued with bad news and then given more bad news to top it off. Yet Hitman 16 had some great reviews, but it was still said to not be good enough. So what happened? Well, in short, in 2017, IOI's publisher Square Enix decided to divest from our beloved murder puzzle developers. And in long, we're going to have to journey all the way back to 1998 to the very beginning of IOInteractive. Don't worry though, I'll make it quick. IOInteractive's inception came as a blending between Retomoto and Nordisk Film. Immediately, the team had a brilliant idea of a stealth-based shooter game following the tales and trials of the most deadly hitman in the world. The team was conceptualizing an MMO fantasy game. Oops. Anyway, Nordisk asked the Retomoto team to focus those ideas down into a simple shooter. That simple shooter was built exclusively for the PC, as the team was new, small, and moreover they couldn't get their hands on any console dev kits. That simple shooter became none other than Hitman, codename 47. Along with the release of their debut title, the Glacier engine was born, later to be improved upon into the Glacier 2 engine, running our current murder puzzle masterpieces. This would prove to be the spark of light that would breathe life into the small developer. Selling over 100,000 copies in the United Kingdom, the small success would allow IOI to develop Hitman 2, Silent Assassin, an impressive iteration that would fix many of the problems of the first attempt of the homicidal head-scratcher of a game. 2 years later, in 2004, IOI was acquired by IOInteractive for 23 million GBP, also known as the first nail in the coffin for IOInteractive. You might want to look at me and say that it was great that they got acquired. It gave the team more resources to make what they wanted and make it even better. And in any other case, I'd agree with you. But in this instance, I see it more as the first domino that fell. The second nail would follow not far after, with the lukewarm release of Kane and Lynch as well as 4 of IOI's founders leaving, taking the executive producer for Eidos with them. Shortly after that, 6 more employees of IOI would follow as well. Mini Ninjas would release after that to the amusement of not a lot of people. With peak concurrent players as of making this script at 49, the overall favorable reviews would not translate to sales numbers. I can't even find sales numbers on the game other than that you can buy it at $1.49 USD right now. On top of that, iOS was absorbed by Square Enix, who became the new overlords of IOI. As the new parent of IOI, there was a watchful eye, and they did not make a good first impression. With 2 of what I would call overwhelming failures in terms of sales and reviews, IOI decided that maybe they needed a return to form, a return to what started everything, to return to Hitman. And thus, Hitman Absolution was born. But I don't really want to talk about the dumpster fire that was Absolution. It might not have been a bad game per se, but it was a bad Hitman game, and I'm gonna say we're gonna have to agree on that because this is a recording, and I get the power to do that. While the game sold well, and reviewed pretty decently, something was beginning to brew in the water, and IOI could see that. Alright, that was a little longer than I thought. Now we can start to get into the meat and potatoes of this whole video, why Square Enix left IOInteractive, and a lot of concepts that I'll explain after digging through a lot of financial data for the company. As we get into these concepts, I want to focus on what I feel the most important ones are. For a preview, we're going to be talking a little later about the timing of revenue recognition, intellectual properties and intangible assets, amortization and goodwill, and the impairment of said goodwill. Don't worry, if that sounds like a lot, I'm gonna do the best I can for each one of these and put it in enough detail to give you an idea, but not too much that you fall asleep. So let's get back to it, shall we? Coming in hot in 2016 was the newest iteration of Hitman that basically said, we heard you about Absolution, and here's how we fixed it. And by God, if they didn't fix it. Gone was the linear short mission-based structure of simply getting from point A to point B and maybe taking out a target in the middle of that. Now the target is truly the mission, and frankly, the star of the show, pun intended. IOI absolutely knocked it out of the park with Hitman 2016 in both design and execution. But that failed too. Why? How does something so strong in presentation, design, mechanics, and execution of gameplay with overwhelmingly positive reviews fail? 2 words: episodic format. Instead of just releasing the full game when it was finished, IOI released the first tutorial mission and Paris. Or basically, they released 2 tutorial missions as an opus to their new structure of level design. NoClip did a whole documentary where it's explained that the episodic format was an utter failure compared to what they were expecting. Hitman 2016 released each location as an episode that were cheaper than buying the whole game, but players bought a season pass anyway, essentially paying full price for a 15% finished game. Loyal fans were that trusting that IOInteractive would release a great Hitman game, and newcomers were so impressed by the formula that they fully invested into the full product, and it wasn't even close to being done. I want to break here and talk about potentially the most important factor that caused the split. Square Enix was in a period of shifting focus to a free-to-play market dominated by longevity. Now that's our keyword, longevity. And unfortunately, from a financial standpoint, our trust was not indicative of a game with longevity. So let's get into the financial concepts at play. First, we have the idea of free onboard shipping and free onboard destination. I'm going to refer to these as FOB shipping and FOB destination from now on, so don't forget that. But what are these concepts? Simply put, it's the timing of how a company recognizes their revenue, or even simpler, when a company is allowed to officially say that they've made money. The key difference is not the amount of money that they will make, it's when they can tell people they've made it. So let's take an example. Say we have 2 points. Point A is a warehouse where the product is stored, in this case Hitman, and point B is the destination of the product, so like a GameStop or a Best Buy. FOB shipping says that as soon as the delivery truck shows up and pick up the copies from point A, the company is rid of the liability of the contract and they can tell people that they made money. However, in FOB destination, the company that has had the product held at point A has to wait until the truck comes, picks up the product, and safely delivers it to its final destination at point B. If anything happens between the time of the pickup of the delivery, say the truck gets run off the road and completely destroyed, the company isn't allowed to tell anyone they made money on that shipment, and they have to eat the loss of the destroyed product. Now, I don't know if a lawyer is ever going to watch this video, and yes, I'm aware of the finer bits of contract law surrounding the risk of loss and who's liable, but this is an example to set the stage, so don't dig into me too hard here. If you're watching this, you're probably thinking, okay, Buck, but who cares? What does this have anything to do about the breakup? Well, I would say to you, it's because Square Enix operates on an FOB shipping method of revenue recognition. So when that truck comes to pick up that physical copy of Hitman 2016, as soon as it's on the truck, they're telling people that they made money. But what about digital copies? Well, that's a little different. Since it's digital, they get to recognize the money as soon as someone purchases it from the various stores like PSN or the Xbox store. And most importantly, they get to recognize it in full. Now, let's take a step back and see what I said about that season pass. In every sense of its foundation, the episodic model would have worked without the season pass in the eyes of Square Enix. Without a season pass, the episodic model could have fit with their idea of longevity. It would have provided a source of recurrent income met over the lifespan of the game as each new episode was released that we would have to pay for it after it's released. If they had locked the payment until the next episode came out, IOI could have smoothed their revenues over a period by breaking up the pay cycle of the game, creating a constant cash flow for the company over the life of Hitman 2016. However, with the season pass and SE's FOB shipping model, physical and digital copies were all totally front-loaded into the release of the game. This is good for generating a lot of cash in the short term, but poor for the longevity of the game from a money-making standpoint. When players purchased the season pass, along with players picking it up digitally, Square Enix recognized it as the money earned. When the physical copies were shipped to GameStop, the revenue was said to be earned before it even ever got to the destination. What this essentially means is that Hitman 2016 had an incredibly explosive start and then had nothing to show after the release monetarily, but it was still completely and contractually obligated to finish the game. Level designers, production engineers, voice actors, and all the like still had to tirelessly work with no more money coming in the door. While this might not have created financial pressure for IOI in developing the game, mostly because they had money to spend, to their overlords at Square Enix all the way in Japan, it starts to paint a picture that IOI can't keep money coming in the door, which would hurt the financial performance as a whole for Square Enix. Couple that with the utter lack of microtransactions, which I really want to make a point in saying is not a bad thing. There was no recurring source of revenue for IOI, and they were heavily depleting the cash balances they had quickly built up with the initial release of Hitman 2016. Going along in those financial statements, like I said, Square Enix was in a period of shifting focus in 2016. And when I say shifting focus, I mean they were creating microtransactions as their primary business model, which it's not like no one else has ever done that.
EA Sports. It's in the game.
But their 2016 annual report confirms this, saying they are focusing on free-to-play and premium games for iOS devices and the like, also known as mobile games with pay-to-win mechanics in it like every other mobile game out there. According to Square Enix, good free-to-play games require a substantial amount of development time, but they still cost considerably less than developing a console game, a la Hitman. All the way back in 2016, which I will argue was the meteoric rise of microtransactions, Square Enix hopped on the bandwagon early and steered clear of EA and went straight to the mobile market. In a strategic sense, it was a brilliant move, and I have to give it to them. They went for mobile games and avoided the lawsuits that EA now faces. Their games cost less to make, and they get to push microtransactions free of relative restrictions. Moving on from that, one of the most expensive assets in gaming is called the intellectual property, or IP for short. This is the bread and butter for gaming companies to say that they have value to their consumers. When you look at games like Final Fantasy, the IP holds incredible value to Square Enix. But did Hitman? No, it didn't. This is because a game's IP is something known as an intangible asset. Now let's break that term into two parts, intangible and asset. In accounting, intangible simply means it's something that you cannot physically touch or see. A tangible asset would be like a t-shirt you can buy in a store, but you can't physically touch an idea. Hitman is an idea, therefore it's a property, and its basis of value is the idea of making it intangible. An asset in its purest sense is anything that has probable future economic value, meaning anything used in the course of business that makes your company money. Hitman fits both of these definitions easily. However, Hitman was not an original IP to Square Enix. It was purchased as part of the Eidos acquisition, and that's going to bring up a new concept called goodwill. The definition of goodwill is anything paid above and beyond the fair market value of all of the assets and liabilities during an acquisition. That's to keep it simple. Now let's look at it a little deeper. When you sell something, you want to make a profit, right? Obviously. And when you buy something, you don't want to buy it for more than it's worth, right? Also true. So at some point, the profit the seller wants to make is settled with what the buyer is willing to pay. In this case, let's take something like a McDonald's. Say the owner, year over year since the beginning of that McDonald's, made $1 million every year. And that happened every year for 5 years. And say I want to buy McDonald's. Do you really think the owner would sell it to me for $1 million? No, of course not. He isn't going to give up the money he's making every year for a one-time payment. But what if I offered him $4.5 million? Do you think he might be a little more receptive then? I think he would be. When thinking of buying a company, you're essentially buying all of the company's assets, including the equipment, buildings, licenses, patents, and future projected profits. Back to the Mickey D's example, if we look at it from a perspective of everything the company owns that makes them money, and take away everything that the company owes to other people, its total value, we'll say, is in the ballpark of $3 million, but I'm offering $4.5 million. He may see it as a profit, but how do I justify the cost? The answer is called goodwill. Remember I said that goodwill is the difference between the perceived value at the time of purchase versus the purchase price at time of acquisition. That means I get to recognize $1.5 million of goodwill when the sale closes. Now apply the same logic and the same numbers to the Hitman IP when Square Enix acquired Eidos. Square Enix would recognize $3 million in the intangible asset in the Hitman IP and $1.5 million in goodwill. And now you're probably thinking, so the numbers went up. Why did they dump IOI? Well, get ready for the next principle of goodwill and intangible assets: impairment and amortization. Amortization just means that we assign a useful life to an intangible asset, like Hitman's IP, and we'll reduce the balance of it over its estimated life, typically 40 years. So if Hitman's IP was 3 million when it was purchased, that means next year when it was presented on a 40-year life that it would show up at 2.925 million on the financial statements, and we would continue to do that every year until that balance reached zero. Notice how I said the balance and not value. In accounting and how these companies present figures, facts, and other information to their shareholders, they have to have the proper accounting for it. Amortization is what we call the systematic and rational assignment of the cost of an asset based on the useful life. The asset is not losing value. Rather, we are using the asset for what it's worth over the life that it's been assigned per year. Now, impairment. You can think of this as the antithesis to amortization. When you impair an asset like goodwill, you are reducing its value. And according to the generally accepted accounting principles in the United States, public companies have to evaluate for impairment of goodwill and its intangible assets on a yearly basis and determine if they should directly write down the value of an asset they hold. You may think I'm getting off topic, but bear with me here because it's important. I want you to put yourself in Square Enix's shoes, and you have the Hitman IP showing up for less and less every year on your financial statements, even more due to the lack of sales and front-loading the recognized revenues related to it. You might be missing budgets and you're not hitting overall targets. Don't you think you'd have to impair the goodwill that you bought for Hitman? In case you're thinking, well, all of that would have just gone up if they waited for Hitman 2, I can tell you why that's not true. The main guiding principle to us accountants is something called historical cost, meaning that when you bring something on the books, it stays that way. It can go down in value, but never, ever, ever go up in value. It's why if you poked around the financial statements of a place like Walt Disney, you'd find that they still have land that they bought in 1970 for $2,000. Today it would be worth millions. But no, that land will stay on the books at the original purchase price until the day it's sold off to someone else. And that's the problem. These assets can never go up in value, only down. All of that goodwill and intangible assets in the form of IPs purchased from IDOs have only one way to go: down. It will never go up again unless they sell it, which they did. In addition, back in 2016, Square Enix had a 3.745 billion yen impairment to their intangible assets due to these principles mentioned previously. While we will probably never see a breakdown of what was attributed to the Hitman franchise and IOI in general, I think it's safe to assume that the impairment put IOI in the crosshairs. Now, as we circle all the way back to the concepts we talked about, to SE's revenue recognition model, to what happened to the sales of Hitman 2006, we can finally talk about why. That's not to say Square Enix is ditching the console genre. They've just narrowed their scope. They have Just Cause, which in retrospect has been utterly laughable, and Tomb Raider. However, during the change-up in focus, they've had some pretty profitable entries like Hoshi no Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy Break Exvius, and Grim Notes all on the mobile platform. Frankly, a microtransaction model just works better for Square Enix. Instead of front-loading the revenue, they're front-loading and capitalizing the cost to make a game. They're adding continuous support with microtransactions that generates a much smoother revenue curve per game. Also, your revenue targets jump in terms of cost performance if you're able to front load all of the costs into the beginning of the product, but microtransactions add minor new additions drip fed continuously during the life of the game. It has potential to span for years. Just look at World of Warcraft, a subscription-based MMO with DLC and microtransactions. They're making money hand over fist, and that's what Square Enix was looking for when they dumped IOI. SE, first and foremost, wanted repeat sales and continuous revenue out of the game, and Hitman in no way could provide it with its past performance. Of course, Square Enix will keep flagship titles like Final Fantasy. It just wasn't profitable for them to keep Hitman as a license and take the costs associated for an otherwise admittedly niche fanbase. I think we can all agree that Hitman will never reach the heights of a Battlefield or Call of Duty. That doesn't mean it's not a great game and not one of my favorite games ever made. But it's not what's in the desire of the market nor the company holding the reins on the future of IOI. And at long last, we have why I believe Square Enix decided to part ways with IOI. Because of this breakup, we almost never even got a Hitman 2. Yet IOI rose from the ashes like a phoenix and preserved through insurmountable adversity, massive layoffs, finishing a game already in the making at the time of the split, and substantial cash flow problems. Even through all of that, they have treated their workers fairly, released Hitman 2, and we have a third installment just over the horizon. If there's nothing else I can say, let me say that I respect the hell out of IOI to push through the pain and continue to release polished content that's mechanically strong with fantastic presentation, all free from gimmicks to milk their consumer base. I wish nothing but the best for IOInteractive, and I hope they continue this model of game design, and I look forward to the release of Hitman 3. I hope you guys found this informative, and if you did, leave a like and maybe even subscribe to get updates of when I release new videos like this. If you have any questions regarding some of the more technical aspects, feel free to let me know in the comments section, or even pop by the Discord server and drop me a ping and I'd be happy to answer any of them to the best of my ability. Above all else, I hope you guys have a beautiful day and I hope you're smiling.